Hi guys, hello everybody. Nice to see you all again. It was nice to be away too, but nice to be back too. Okay, yes, we are recording, and there we go. Okay, so I didn't actually tell you what this class was going to be about because I didn't know myself until a few minutes ago. But let's get to it right away, and then you'll sort of figure out what's going on. Okay, there is a very famous Kabbalistic work, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, which is called the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. Sefer Yetzirah. It is one of the, if not the most ancient Kabbalistic work. It's attributed to Abraham. He was said to have composed it, although he did not write it down. It was written down by Rabbi Akiva, a first century sage, who committed to writing, as many of the other oral teachings were committed to writing at around that time, namely the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the basic outline of the Talmud in very sort of cryptic and condensed form, and then subsequently the Talmud, and at the same time various Kabbalistic works, including the Zohar and so on and so forth. And the Sefer Yetzirah was also written down at that time, just before the Zohar, in the generation before the Zohar, actually. But it was an extremely important, it is an extremely important work, although it is a very cryptic one at that. Nice to hear that you're studying it in your study group. Very nice, Chai 10. Very good. I'm actually doing a commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah, but it's in Hebrew. It may come out in English eventually, we'll see. All right, so the Sefer Yetzirah, one of the things that it states in the Sefer Yetzirah, in fact, one of the foundational concepts in the Sefer Yetzirah, is that there are three dimensions to everything. There's what's called Olam, Shana, and Nefesh. Now, translate those. Olam means literally the world, or if we put it more precisely, space. Shana is year, literally, but it's a word which means essentially the concept of time. So we have space, we have time, and then we have nefesh, which translated would be soul or consciousness. So space, time, and consciousness, these three things, says the Sefer Yetzirah, are intertwined. And they intertwine in such a way that they're intertwined in such a way that whatever happens with one of them is visible in some way or another in the other. So in other words, it's sort of like I think we've spoken about this before, kind of quantum entanglement, that whatever happens with this particular quantum area is reflected in another quantum area, even though they don't seem to have any particular connection one to the other. I wouldn't say they're inside one another, but they sort of overlap. So space-time and consciousness overlap. Each has its particular area of activity, but there is an overlap in the middle, such that if something happens, for example, in space, the awareness of that in consciousness is sort of stamped into consciousness, even though the average person might not be aware of it. But those who are in control, so to speak, of their consciousness, those people will, in fact, be able to know what is going on in space and in time. Therefore, you will get great Kabbalists who were able to relive various moments in past history and were able to live events that had not yet occurred, and that's how they knew about them. They were able to actually see them, to experience them in their consciousness, in soul. So why am I discussing this this issue, this concept in the Sefer Yetzirah? Well, this week, as everybody probably knows, this week is the first section of the Torah. The Torah is the Bible. The first section of the Bible is, we start the Bible again this coming week. This Sabbath on the Shabbat, we read the first portion of the Bible, which is called Bereshit, the parasha, the section of Bereshit. Bereshit, in the beginning of God's creating the world, the heavens and earth, etc., etc. So, since creation includes heavens and earth, sun and moon, and the stars and so on and so forth, so it's pointed out that heavens and earth includes all of space, and the sun and the moon is the means by which originally we measured time. By the cycles of the sun and the moon is how we measure time. So that time is included. And of course, since those two are present, there must be the third aspect present, which is consciousness. Now, initially divine consciousness, but that consciousness is then imparted to human beings. God created the human being and endowed him with consciousness to know the difference between good and evil. Now, when it says to know the difference between good and evil, it doesn't only mean just good and evil. It means much more than just good and evil. It means what's right and what's wrong, what's proper, what's improper. And so it goes right through all of creation, what's right and wrong, proper, improper, the right place, the wrong place in space, what's proper, what's good, what's right, etc., in time, and so on and so forth. So you get propitious times and times that are not so propitious, auspicious times and inauspicious times, and auspicious places and perhaps some inauspicious places, which I could think of quite a few. I suppose the Arctic circles, Arctic and Antarctic, would be not exactly the most hospitable places, and probably there's some countries in between those two that are not exactly the most hospitable either. North Korea comes to mind, and so on and so forth. But anyway, let's not get into any politics here. Okay, so this Sabbath we will begin again the Bible begins again from the account of creation. Now, there's a very important commentator, probably the most important commentator from, sorry about that, I usually take the phone upstairs, but sometimes I forget. The commentator Rashi, Rabbi Yitzhak was his name, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Shlomo, and he was, I'm sorry, not Yitzhak ben Shlomo, that's the Arizal, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzhak. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, as he's called, Rashi. Very, very important commentator, 1200s, 1100s, 1200s, and he writes a commentary comprised of all kinds of rabbinical statements, but in a way that they can be understood by people who are not necessarily very learned. He tries to give the simple, straightforward explanation. So Rashi asks a very important question. He says, why is it, he's quoting actually a midrashic source, a rabbinical source of much earlier antiquity, about from the 500-600s. And the midrash asks the question, why does the Torah begin with the account of creation? Why does the Bible begin with the account of creation? Isn't the Torah there, isn't the Bible there to simply impart to us all of the mitzvot, all of the commandments, God's commandments, and what he wants us to do in this world? So why does it tell us an account of creation that doesn't seem to have any real bearing on what it is that we're supposed to do in the world? And he answers, again, he quoting the Midrash, he answers that because it may be sometime in the future that people will come along and they will say to the Israelites, why did you take this land from us? And our answer to them is, God created the land, the Holy Land, the land of Israel, like He created all of creation, and He gave it to whom He pleased. He took it from them and gave it to us. Now, we have to understand what's going on over here. That seems to be a little bit of a simplistic story. Took it away and gave it to us, and that's our reason for the no, we have not changed that much, Andrea. We have not. Okay. What is going on over here? So the story behind the story is essentially this, that there's the area of the holy, and then there's the area of the mundane. There's the holy and the mundane. And you would think that as a religious people, Jews would really only be interested in the holy and forget about the mundane. After all, that seems to be the modus operandi of most religions in the world. You know, you go off to your ashram, to the Himalayas, to your cave, and you disappear from the world. And excuse me. And or to the monastery or to some retreat or whatever it is, you disappear from the world and you're not involved in the world at all. That's the world of religion. And you have nothing to do with the world, and you live a life of celibacy, probably, and a life of being essentially divorced from the world. And yet, the Torah comes along and says to us, no, that's not what God wanted. God wanted that you should actually live in the world at the same time as being devoted to the world of the spirit. You have to bring the world of the spirit into the mundane world, the world of the soul, the world of divine consciousness into the physical world. And that's what the nations of the world complain about Israel. Why is it that you live in two worlds? How are you justified in living in the physical world when you claim to be expert in the spiritual worlds? Why don't you just leave it to us? Why don't you leave the physical world to those who are not interested in the spirit, and you go do your thing? And that's the answer that we give them. This tchum, this area, this division between the holy and the mundane is an illusion. The mundane was also created by God. The mundane world in which we live is in fact a divine act. Yes, it's a divine act of concealment in order to, or rather not in order, but when creating the physical world, God concealed His presence, and that's why the word olam in Hebrew, I'll just write over here in so you can see it. I'll write it in the chat. O-L-A-M, olam, or I'll write it in Hebrew for those who read Hebrew. Olam is from the word he'elem. He'elem meaning concealment. He'elem, concealment. So when God created the world, He created it in a process of self-concealment. He concealed His infinite revelation so that it could be a finite world. Otherwise, the finite world would just be swallowed up into the infinite revelation. So although it does seem that there is a barrier between the holy and the mundane, that barrier is essentially only there to be traversed. The barrier is there in order to be overcome, to be conquered. Now, there's a very important concept. I was actually, while I was away, one of the places I was in Florida, and I met a delightful old man. Oh, let's not call him an old man, elderly man, um, 90 years old, who originally lived in Israel, but all his faculties, he has all his faculties about him. He's very, very sharp, very interesting person as well. So he pointed out to me a very interesting concept, the concept of conquest. There's two types of conquest, or no, let's put it this way, there are two types of war. Let me just answer a question quickly. Rabbi, how can we hear that word from the divine in this world of noise that surrounds us? Running away to a cave or mountain does not seem to be the answer. No, it's not the answer. I'm going to answer that, the whole question, shortly, Dennis. I'm getting to it. So let's get back to the story about this elderly man who mentioned to me that he heard from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that's Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who is was a very, very great saint and a person of tremendous, tremendous, tremendous wisdom and insight. And he proposed the following idea. He said that there's two kinds of war. One is sort of protective or defensive war, and the other one's an offensive war. Now, most people, being that they're not warlike people, maybe I'm wrong there. The Romans were certainly warlike people, and there are many others that were. I guess the Goths and the Visigoths and various other warring tribes and so on were very warlike, but the Jewish people generally are not warlike. At least they try not to be. We would much rather live in peace than at war. But in any event, there are two types of war. One type of war is defensive. One type of war is offensive. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said as follows. What's the difference essentially between the two? Well, a defensive war is when the enemy attacks you and you defend yourself. The problem with a defensive war is that the enemy is going to use his strongest forces to attack your weakest point. He's going to use his strongest forces to attack your weakest point, to breach the wall, so to speak. And he's going to choose the time that is most convenient for him. The enemy is going to choose the time. But that's the way it seems that in the spiritual wars that we are talking about, because we're not talking only about physical battle, but really we're talking about the internal battle between good and evil within ourselves. As we said before, anything that happens in the outside world, in the world, also happens in the soul, in consciousness. So we have this struggle between good and evil. In Hebrew, this is called the nefesh elokit, the godly soul, and the animal soul, the nefesh bahamit. Right? The godly soul and the animal soul are in this constant struggle until the person actually manages to vanquish completely the animal soul and transform it into a human being. An animal soul simply follows its passions and follows its desires, and does not. You never saw a cow sitting down on its rear end and looking up at the sky and saying, I wonder where that came from. At least I don't do in Iowa, but I haven't come across come across a bovine creature that looks to me to be very philosophically inclined. Be that as it may, there may be such, but I'm not aware of them. In any event, the idea is to overcome that animal soul and transform it into a human being, transform the animal into human. Then the person becomes, in a sense, superhuman. He doesn't have that animal, he or she does not have that animal side to them. They become all human and, in fact, more divine than human. Okay, so in the war where the enemy chooses the time and chooses the place and chooses the people against whom he's going to launch his offense, where the defendant is obviously at a disadvantage. He doesn't know when he's going to be attacked. he or she doesn't know where they're going to be attacked, and they don't know what type of attack it's going to be and the forces that are going to be arrayed against them, and so on and so forth. And that's the problem with the defensive war. Said the Lubavitcher Rebbe, you cannot. People tried this defensive war for too long already, and it didn't work. We have to go on the offensive. Now, the offensive doesn't mean, again, I'm not talking about actually making war against other people. As you know, Israel simply tried to protect its own borders. There have been wars when they've conquered territory, but that was territory that originally belonged to Israel before the partition that the British divided up Israel into two parts. Part gave to Jordan, part to Egypt, Syria, etc., etc. Anyway, let's not get into that now. This is not the point. The point is that in the fight against our own innate evil inclination, or inclination to evil, inclination to incompleteness, to our inclination to just do the bare minimum necessary to elevate ourselves, maybe not even that. So in that fight, said the Lubavitcher Rebbe, it is much more productive to go out to the enemy. Why? Because you can choose then where to attack. You can choose the time. And another factor which I didn't mention is that whenever there's a war, the defendant is always going to suffer some casualties and some destruction and ruin in some way or another. Buildings are going to get ruined, people are going to get killed, and so on and so forth. But if you take the war to the enemy, it's much more likely that they will be damaged and harmed rather than you will be harmed. Now, what kind of war, therefore, are we talking about? Well, this is exactly what we were talking about originally. To take the area which is regarded normally as the mundane, and to transform it inch by inch, bit by bit, perhaps millimeter by millimeter, transform it into a higher level of holiness. And then once that achieves a higher level of holiness, then we go further, another higher level of holiness. Now, there's various ways in which this can be done. And Shiva asked a very valid question. Is Torah study our best effort in that war? That's one of the aspects. Another aspect is proper behavior, which would be called the mitzvot, the commandments, fulfilling the commandments. Another area is the area of prayer. In fact, the Zohar, the famous Kabbalistic work by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, again written 1st, 2nd century, the Zohar says, Sha'at tzluta, Sha'at krova, or Sha'at tzlota, Sha'at krova. The time of prayer is the time of battle. The most difficult, heated battles that we have are with ourselves when we are at prayer, to focus, to concentrate, to open up, to really make prayers meaningful and make them into a vehicle for self-elevation. Why did I say self-elevation? Because in Jacob's dream, when Jacob was fleeing from Esau, his brother, and he came to the area outside of the land of Israel called Haran. So he slept there that night. He surrounded himself with rocks so that he wouldn't be attacked by animals or whatever. Surrounded his head with rocks, and he dreamed. And the dream he had was he dreamed of a ladder, and the foot of the ladder was on the ground, and the head of the ladder, the top of the ladder, was in the heavens. And angels were descending and ascending, or ascending and descending on that ladder. That ladder, says the Zohar, is the ladder of prayer. That prayer has a particular structure. It begins at the bottom. It begins with, if you ever look into a Hebrew prayer book called a Siddur, Siddur just means an arrangement, the arrangement of the prayers. It usually starts with very, very mundane things and then moves slowly more and more and more towards the spiritual side of things until it moves to unitary consciousness, which is what is called the Shema prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and so on. And then there's the aspect of petition, which is called in Hebrew Shmona Esrei, the 18 benedictions, the 18 blessings, etc., where one asks for wisdom and so on and so forth. But the structure of prayer is such that it starts off at the bottom and it moves its way up until the top of it touches the heavens. And that's really another way in which this can be achieved. So there's three ways in which to achieve it. One is through study of the biblical texts, and not only biblical texts, but obviously anything included, all of the biblical framework, the writings of the rabbis, the writings of Kabbalah, and so on, and also through proper action and through proper prayer. That's how we connect. Prayer is, in fact, the way in which we connect. It's a connection to God. It's a time that we spend, in a sense, although we always try to daven in a quorum. A quorum means 10 people together, right? Daven in a quorum, pray in a quorum, 10 people together, 10 men together, over the age of 13, because that is regarded as a complete entity. Since all of us are lacking in one aspect or another, when you have 10 people together, so your strengths compensate for my weaknesses, and my strengths compensate for your weaknesses. So it's regarded as having a complete system, a closed system, so to speak, although it can be many more than 10, it can be 100, it can be 1,000, it can be 10,000. This last weekend, not last weekend, this last few days, I was in New York, and I was in a very, very, very large group of people. I would imagine there were at least 8 to 10,000 people there, and basically taking the roof off the building, singing, dancing, and so on and so forth. Very joyous time. In any event, so it's a time of connection. Prayer is a time of connection. Study is a time of expanding consciousness, and proper action, fulfilling the mitzvot, the commandments, and doing in general, doing good deeds, helping out other people and so on, brings the body into the picture, so that the physical, even the physical world in which we normally live, becomes holy. In fact, there's a beautiful story that I heard from someone about the famous Rabbi Zusha. Rabbi Zusha of Anipoli was a Hasidic rabbi. He did not regard himself as a Rebbe, as a grand master, although he certainly was one, but he sort of regarded himself only as a student. But one day, after he'd fulfilled the commandment of what's called lulav and etrog, taking the citron and the palm branch, etc., and fulfilling the commandment of waving them at this time of the year, just in a couple of weeks that passed. So after he did that, he was kissing his hands, and I said to him, "What are you doing?" So he said that, I would not have been able to fulfill that commandment if I didn't have hands. How would I have done it? And therefore, I'm sort of, so to speak, grateful for the hands that I have, and therefore I have to kiss them, because they were just in contact with fulfilling the divine will in doing that, fulfilling that particular commandment. So he was a very, very, very interesting, character. And actually, today was the day of the passing of Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Bardichev. Levi Yitzhak Bardichev, who was a very, very, also a very famous Hasidic rabbi, and one who was known as the lover of mankind. He just loved people, and he would do anything to help people out. Anything. It was literally, but he was also a very, very holy person. One of the stories that's told about him, he was at a wedding of his, I think it was his son, and the daughter of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And these two great Hasidic luminaries made a wedding, and of course all of the disciples came to the wedding, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people crashing into the room, or trying to crash into the room and surrounding the house with that they were in, and they had to get out, and there was just no way they could get out. They couldn't sort of push their way out because there were so many people, like, pushing to get in, and they simply could not get out. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak turned to Rabbi Shneur Zalman and he said, let's just reconstitute ourselves on the other side of the wall. In other words, basically go through the wall. And he said, yeah, but not in public. We don't want to do that in public. So you see that he was a very holy person, since his entire body was consciously only a vehicle for the divine, a vehicle for divinity. Since divinity is everywhere, it could be on the other side of the wall, on the other side of the house, through the wall, just as much as it's over here. That physicality wouldn't have prevented him from doing such a thing in any event. So the idea, therefore, is the war that we have to wage is to conquer the mundane and make it holy. Now, what does that mean? That means simply, it doesn't mean, it means the opposite of going out into your cave, into your ashram, into your monastery, and divorcing yourself from the world. It means going out into the world and showing or teaching how it should be done, how the world itself is a divine vehicle that was created by God to become a vessel in which through which godliness can be revealed. And that is, in fact, the whole idea of why the world was created. It was created in the way that it was created. It was created in the way of herlem, of concealment of divinity, so that man could bring about the revelation of godliness in the world through his actions, through his prayer, and through his raising up of consciousness through study, through Torah study. And that is our goal. That's the mission in life. In other words, the why are we here? That's the why. The why we are here is to make this world into as much of a vessel for holiness as the higher worlds, and even more so. Because in the higher worlds, you don't have corporeality. When the corporeal, material world can become holy, then that world transcends even the highest of the worlds, because it's a contradiction in a sense. The corporeal world can reveal godliness to a greater extent than the spiritual worlds. It includes two opposites. In any event, if anyone wants to read a bit more about this, there is the famous Hasidic work, Shneur Zalman V'Liadi, called Tanya. Have a look in Tanya chapter 36, where it speaks more about that idea. Okay, I'm going to stop over here. Are there any questions? So that could only bring Messiah. It could be, yeah, that's the Messianic era, is when godliness is revealed in the world, not by God, but by us, by human beings doing the right thing, by us transforming the world. Yes, it could be. Of course, God could create the world in such a way that it would reveal his godliness, but he didn't want that to happen, because that's called in the Talmud and the Zohar, call it Nahamadichi, the Kisufa, the bread of shame, right? The bread of shame, because you're given it for free. You didn't work for it. And therefore you don't appreciate it. It has to be something that we work for, and therefore something that we can appreciate to a much greater degree. Better get busy, yeah. Having a philosophical conversation with a bovine could just be plain bull. Very nice. Very good, Dennis. A sense of humor is a vital part of life. People who don't have a sense of humor, people who don't have a sense of humor, unfortunately, are missing out. Life is rich when there's humor involved. In fact, on more than one occasion, I've told some of my people who come to ask me for advice, clients, you could call them, I suppose, to on a daily basis read jokes from clean jokes, not to be dirty, silly, filthy jokes, but just jokes, because there are people who are generally much too what's called in Hebrew Morosh Choradik. They have this black cloud hanging over their head and it's raining. And they don't realize that the black cloud is coming from themselves. So one of the ways of dealing with that is simply to learn to laugh. Laughter is the best medicine that there is for all kinds of ailments. In fact, there are various Kabbalistic works that explain that when the angel said to Sarah that she was going to have a child, it says, "Vatitzchak Sarah bekirba." Sarah laughed within herself. So there are those that obviously take it as she was the listen. I'm beyond the age when I can have. She was pretty old at that time. I'm beyond the age in which I can have children. And so she laughed, sort of mockingly, scorning what the angel had said. There are Kabbalistic works that do not interpret it that way. They interpret it in a positive sense, that her laughing made her open to becoming pregnant. Laughter is the best medicine that there is. Yeah, God laughs. Sure, he does. In fact, it says that Schok asa lanu Elokim. God made laughter for us. He made laughter. Isaac was therefore called Yitzchak from the word tzchok. Tzchok means laughter, because God made us laugh. That a woman the age of Sarah and a man the age of Abraham were able to have a child at that age is a matter for laughter, but not scoffing and mocking laughter, but laughter, genuine laughter. And I think you'll find amongst the more enlightened psychologists these days, and probably the various people on the listening in now that could verify this for me. Terry is an example. That laughter is there's laughter therapy. Now I don't know if one actually has to go to a psychologist to learn laughter therapy, but if one learns to laugh at yourself as well as at good jokes, life is a whole different. That takes on a whole different quality. Right, that is correct. God created laughter, since hence he laughs. Yes. There's a story told in the Talmud that the sages were having an argument with God, and they won the argument. And God laughs and he says, "Nitzchuni bana nitzchuni." You defeated me in argument. You defeated me, and he laughed because a parent wants their child to get beyond where what they managed to achieve. We all want our children to do better than us, I'm sure. At least from my experience, that's the way it is. So, yeah, laughter. Yeah, there you go. Laughter groups. Yeah. Laughter yoga. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing to tell amusing stories and good, clean, healthy jokes, and that is a way of healing. And in fact, if I may say so, the word, the first words of the Torah are Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'at haaretz. In the beginning, God created bara. He created the heavens and the earth. And one of the commentaries, a commentary called Mase Elokim, the work of God, or the deeds of God. I don't know how you would translate it, probably like that way, in God's deeds. So he translates the word bara, created, as being related to the word bari. Bari means health. So in a sense, you could say God created good health, right? He created good health. And in order to access that good health, you need to be in a good mood. One of the ways of being in a good mood is through gratitude. Another way of being in a good mood is through jokes, and they're not mutually exclusive. Okay, Wendy said, a very well-known book called The Anatomy of an Illness by Norman Cousin talks specifically about healing from a very severe illness by laughing. Wow, now that is very nice. I'm going to look that up. That's great. So there you go. God created healing. In the beginning, God created healing, and that was the world of tikkun, as we talk about in Kabbalah from time to time. It says in the beginning, in the World Series. Yeah. Yeah, we just began. Someone asked me if I could talk about the World Series. Now, I had to ask my wife what exactly the World Series. Don't forget, I'm South African originally, so I'm not so familiar with the World Series. But she thinks it's baseball. Am I right? The World Series is baseball. Good. In any event, the World Series, I said, let's not talk about the World Series. Let's talk about the series of the world. In other words, how all the series of worlds come into being. All right. Enough for now. And see you all hopefully next week. Have a great one. Sweet New Year. And may it be fruitful and pleasant and filled with laughter. Shabbat Shalom. All the best.